Okay. Can people hear me? Not as much as you'd like. By the end of this, your opinion may be reversed, but for now, you'd like to hear more. Okay? Is that good enough? Louder. Maybe I should just speak louder. That's another alternative. Okay. I'll try to. I will get animated as the evening wears on, and I'll be plenty audible. So I guess we might as well get started. Thanks everybody for coming. My name's Robert Wright. I'm visiting Professor of Science and Religion here at Union Theological Seminary. And tonight we're going to talk about God in the age of science. And I can honestly think of nobody better qualified to talk about that than John Haught, our guest tonight. John started teaching his course at Georgetown University on science religion back in the early 1970s. And he's been thinking about this stuff ever since. For the most part, that work has been done at Georgetown, where he's still a professor. For a number of years, he was head of the theology department there. And if you don't believe that he's been thinking about this pretty much continuously ever since, let me just read you the titles of some of his books. God After Darwin, Evolution and the Meaning of Life, Meaning and Truth in the Age of Science, Christianity and Science Toward a Theology of Nature. His most recent book came out a little less than a year ago from Yale University Press, is called The New Cosmic Story Inside Our Awakening Universe. And this is just a small sample. He's written about 20 books. I could have gone on. A few of the books do not make explicit reference to science in the title, so he wrote a book called What is God? I'm glad about that, because I've been wondering what the answer to that question is, and I'll be asking him before the evening is over. I think I'll say that until the end, just to make sure nobody leaves early. That's the answer to that will come at the end, and you will remove all doubt and uncertainty. So, and I really want to emphasize how unusual I think it is to see the level of engagement we've seen with these issues. I'm really not aware of another theologian who has grappled as thoroughly with issues at the interface of science and philosophy and religion, and is as conversant in as many parts of science and as deeply conversant as John is. One interesting thing about John is the extent of his emphasis on respecting the authority of science within its proper domain. So just to give you an example, some of you may have heard the phrase intelligent design. It's a kind of a movement, a set of ideas whose upshot is, you could say, is that evolution as it's taught in the classroom is not enough to explain evolution. In other words, you can't explain, according to intelligent design, you can't explain the evolution of complexity and of human beings entirely through kind of the Darwinian mechanisms that are taught in the class. And there was a pretty famous court case in Pennsylvania where they were teaching intelligent design in the classroom as part of the science curriculum, and there were some parents who objected to that because they didn't think it was science. And John actually testified on behalf of the parents against the school board that had been teaching intelligent design. And I think your side won, is that right? Or did your side lose?
Yes.
You won?
Yes.
Okay. I think I want to start out. There's a lot of terrain we could cover and stay within John's scope of expertise. I want to start out talking about evolution, and one good way to do that, I think, is to talk about someone who had a formative influence on John. I think I'm going to switch to Jack, because that's what you actually go by, and that's what I'm used to calling you. You've said that you might not have gotten into this business at all had you not read Teilhard de Chardin. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuit priest, theologian, also a scientist, a paleontologist, generally known as something of a mystic.
Yes, I was in my early 20s when I first read Teilhard, and at that time I was studying to be a priest. I dropped out later on, and partly because I saw in Teilhard's vision an opportunity to take up a life as a lay theologian. Because I was blown away by his vision, it offered me an alternative to what then was becoming somewhat stuffy. I was trained in the thought of Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism. I had to memorize a great deal of his thought in Latin, and I'm so glad I went through that period. But toward the end of the Second Vatican Council, there was a lot of ferment going on in the church and in my own life. But I wanted to hold on to something that I had picked up on all the years I was in the seminary, and he sort of brought it to a head. And at the same time, he brought it into contact with the modern world, which I was about to enter into. And I started at Catholic University the following year, and I started immersing myself in Teilhard's thought then. And until this day, I'm not as uncritical of Teilhard today as I was then, but I still think his vision has relevance for our understanding of contemporary Catholicism, contemporary Christianity, and the whole world situation, and above all for this whole question of how to relate the natural sciences to a theological vision.
Right. No, and I think even if you don't come to it from a religious perspective, you have to be impressed by his kind of prescience. I mean, he was writing back when most Americans did not even have telephones yet, and he was saying, you have to realize, if you look at where technology is heading, we're building a planetary nervous system. We're building a giant global brain, and this is, a century before the internet, or at least a century before the current manifestation of the internet. And he used the term noosphere to talk about this emerging thinking envelope of the Earth, and it was a vision of a kind of, the kind of humankind as forming the kind of brain of what you could see as a kind of giant superorganism. So I think on those grounds alone, you have to be impressed by his vision. I think he deserves more attention than he gets.
Yes, he was really one of the first scientists of the 20th century to have discovered and to make a point of emphasizing that the universe that we live in has the character of a story or a drama. It was only after Einstein that we could really firmly conclude to that, but he was one of the first to pick up on that. And he said we have to get into our thoughts, into our faith, into all of our thinking, the fact that the universe that we live in is still coming into being. And all the great traditions that we come from, none of them knew that. So this makes the whole business of faith completely different now from what it was before. Because for the most part, especially in the Christian tradition, the universe was thought of as a background, a stage, a platform on which the human drama was carried out. But after Darwin, after geology, and especially after contemporary post-Einsteinian cosmology, we now realize that the whole cosmos is in motion, is in moving. And that makes religion different. Religion then is not so much something that is done on the earth or in nature. Religion and faith are things that the universe is doing through us. So what's going on in the universe was his big question. And for him, something really interesting. The universe is awakening. It's an awakening phenomenon. It's not just a place where humans awaken or where life comes about. The whole cosmos itself is an awakening process. Awakening to what? For him, it had to be something indestructible if it was to be meaningful. And in terms of that notion of something indestructible that he wants to talk about the whole notion of God. Not so much as the beginning of it all, but as the goal to which the cosmos is awakening. That's his general vision of things. And it's so different from the medieval kind of Catholicism that I picked up in seminary, and it still prevails in Catholicism as well as in other quarters of Christianity as well. So there's a lot to think about. The difference faith makes, the difference theology makes, when you locate it in the context of a cosmos that's still coming into being.
Right. So he made a couple of connections that maybe hadn't been emphasized enough. I mean, there were a couple of places he saw continuity where maybe it hadn't been seen so much, and certainly not as a part of theological thought. So one was between biological evolution and kind of human cultural and technological evolution. So he saw that human society was getting more complex and more far-flung and increasingly global in scale, and he saw that as an extension, an organic outgrowth of biological evolution, which, as he noted, had done the same thing, creating more and more complex animals. Eventually you get humans, then we build this complexity that we are in turn enmeshed in, and then, as you note, and this is a big theme in your most recent book, The New Cosmic Story, he saw continuity between the prebiotic universe, before life and life. So it's all just kind of a natural emergence, according to him.
Yes, throughout most of modern history, scientists and others have acted as though humans do not really belong here. They pay lip service to the idea, yes, we're all part of the universe, but somehow the scientific mind has been estranged from the cosmos, which gave rise to it. And yet, for Teilhard, what is most obvious in the light of evolution and cosmology is that we humans are just as much part of the universe as toads and flowers and frogs or whatever. And so if you really want to understand the universe, you can't leave mind, you can't leave humanity, and you can't leave our creativity and our inventiveness out of the picture of your understanding of the universe. Mm-hmm. The universe and humans are a package deal. And unfortunately, we've made physics the paradigmatic science, but physics prescinds from or abstracts from mind. But a wider physics, a wider empiricism, a wider taking into account what we really experience would tell us that we are just as much part of the universe as anything else. So if you want to understand the universe, one way to do so is to start with material subatomic particles, but another way is to start with mind and all that mind is capable of doing in the way of creativity, in the way of belief, in the way of faith, and in the way of inventiveness and so forth. And all that's part of a very rich picture of the universe, which we still don't believe.
Right. So, so for starters, of course, obviously, Teilhard saw purpose in this. This was the unfolding of purpose. It was a teleological conception of evolution, which is, of course, not popular among a lot of biologists. Now, I gather there's kind of some disagreement over whether he would be on the side of the intelligent design people or not. In other words, was he positing some kind of ongoing divine assistance, which is kind of the implicit takeaway of the intelligent design people, or did he see the mechanism itself as Darwinian, but kind of nonetheless manifesting a purpose?
I think one of the big mistakes that's been made in this whole intelligent design period is people have confused design with purpose. When Teilhard talks about a purposeful universe, he doesn't mean the same thing that intelligent design people meant. Purpose simply means the orientation of a process toward the realization of something that's self-evidently valuable. And is the universe that sort of phenomenon? We think of our own lives as having a purpose if they're dedicated toward bringing about values or making them actual: peace, justice, love, truth, making the environment better, and so forth. That's something that gets us up in the morning. So what he's interested in is the question, is there something analogous to that that's going on in the cosmos as a whole? Is the cosmos in the process of realizing something that's self-evidently good and valuable? And if you look at it in the long run, and you recognize the tie-in between the physics of the universe, the evolutionary character of life, and the fact of humans, there's a connection such that the orientation of the universe toward consciousness, toward awakening, is self-evidently purposeful, because you cannot deny that your consciousness has value. If you're sitting there asking, does my consciousness, does my mind have value? You're valuing your consciousness spontaneously. Well, it's a pretty good universe that's been in the process of bringing about this interesting phenomenon of consciousness. And consciousness does not necessarily stop with us, as Bob was intimating. For as far as Teilhard's concerned, behind our backs, over our heads, under our feet, this process of complexifying the universe to the point where the leap into thought and the deeper forms of consciousness takes place is still going on. And for all we know, I mean, the universe is 13.8 billion years old. In the long run, this 13.8 billion years could turn out to be the very dawn of an ongoing creative process. So he wanted, as a Catholic priest, as a Jesuit, he wanted to feel, his fellow believers to feel that they're not here on earth just to prove themselves virtuous in a squirrel cage moral type of existence so that when they die they can go to heaven. He wants people of faith to see that they have a deeper and richer vocation of contributing to the ongoing creation of the universe. And this is something that was very difficult for himself to come to, because he was trained in a kind of spirituality that was very otherworldly. So he thought throughout his whole life, he was confronted by what he called the problem of the two faiths, whether to believe in God in heaven or to believe in earth. And he thought both of them were problematic. If you believe just in earth and nature and the universe, since the universe is going to come to a bitter end someday and go down to the pit of nothingness, he thought if that's what you believe, then why would you bother to do anything seriously? So what he came up with was an alternative, one in which the above is synthesized with the ahead. He was deeply influenced by the wind. He found an interesting consonance between the hope that he had picked up in his religious faith and the forward thrust of the cosmos toward increasing complexity, that he got excited about movements in technology. He was sometimes called the prophet of the internet because before he died, he was infatuated by computers and what they could do. And he thought that the earth itself, through technology, through politics, economics, and other developments, is clothing itself in something like a brain. And just as when primate evolution complexified the brains of our primate ancestors to the point where the leap into thought could take place, he asked, is it possible that the earth itself is now complexifying itself physiologically through technology and communications and so forth in such a way that something is struggling to be born in this world as well? And he thought that it was, but he had the caution, unless the next stage of evolution of cosmic process, cosmic complexification, has a force of attraction that can pull the entities, the monads, the units, the atoms together, just as it happened earlier in evolution, then the whole thing could fall apart. So what is needed now that the earth, the universe by way of the earth, has reached the point of a new degree of complexification, it needs a great hope held in common. And added to that, it needs a force of attraction, which he called love. So it's only if we open ourselves to the great messages of the great traditions, in his case, the Christian tradition, and its moral exhortation to love one another, the whole thing will fall apart. So evolution has become conscious of itself in us, but we have the freedom either to carry it on, to look at the previous lessons nature has taught us. When things get together, they associate, then they integrate, then they burst into something new. Atoms became cells, cells became higher animals, and so forth. Eventually, vertebrates came along. This power of this centering force, which he called the force of centration, has been operative throughout the cosmos. So each phase needs a center around which to organize itself if it's going to become something new in the story of evolution. So now what we need to look for, and this is where we bring both faith and science together, is a force of attraction that can allow the universe to develop into something even more beautiful and wonderful than in the past. But it's up to us. And we are capable of great evil, and freedom can opt either for growth and complexity and more intense beauty and consciousness, or it can opt back to the fragmentation and multiplicity out of which the universe evolved in the first place. So that's our mission. That's where faith and science can come together.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to say, I think, even from my perspective, I mean, I don't come to this from any particular faith tradition, but just as an observer of evolution, I have actually suggested in writing that it does seem to have some of the hallmarks of a purposeful system, which isn't to say it's being driven by anything but mechanics. I'm not departing from a Darwinian view, but at the same time, if you look at the direction of it, and recently the drama of the story, it's just kind of amazing that, first of all, as you suggested, consciousness is part of the deal,
yes,
for reasons we don't really understand. And I mean, philosophers, the collective view of philosophers these days on consciousness, I would say, can be summarized as, we don't have a clue. There are different views, but there's nothing like a consensus, and I think the most astute philosophers are pointing out, there's no reason for natural selection to create conscious animals. That there's no obvious reason for that to enter the picture, but it does seem to be a property of the universe that complex biological information processing brings consciousness, and as you say, that brings meaning.
Yeah.
Okay, so evolution is like a machine for generating more and more meaning, and then it has driven human beings into social circles of growing scope, and has forced them to break down barriers, right, between ethnicities and so on, and now we seem to be on the verge of forming a cohesive global community, but it does seem that something dramatic will have to happen. I mean, the whole thing reads like a novel, and I guess I have two questions. One is, do you agree with me that I think it's good that, some attention is being paid to Teilhard today, but it seems to be largely from a kind of environmentalist standpoint, which is fine. One takeaway from him certainly is we should take care of the planet, but it seems to me the part about love, if you look at two of our great problems today, one you could say is environmentalism, the other is the problem that's sometimes called the problem of the psychology of tribalism, whatever, just sectarian conflict, ideological conflict, national conflict. It seems to me that, that's an important, Teilhard speaks to that. I don't think people are focusing on that as much, on what he has to say about that. And then also, I'd kind of like you to elaborate a little on this, what did you say, a center of attraction, or, what?
Centration.
So what form might this thing we're waiting for take?
Very good. Well, let me get to that. Let me go back to your first point about the impact of Teilhard on environmental thinking. During his own lifetime, he was no more sensitive to ecological issues than anybody else. But he did something to Christianity that no one else has done. The whole of his corpus of writings was to point out how we can love the earth, love nature, without feeling in any way that we're turning our back on God. And that has not always been true. And he also, at the same time, taught us how we can love God without thinking we have to abandon nature. Our way to God is through nature. He's much more naturalistic than maybe previous theologians had been, but at the same time, he's also devoted to the notion of something transcendent, something that's the source of beauty. So, kind of like other people, he thought that the purpose of the universe is to maximize beauty. Alfred North Whitehead said this much more explicitly, and so our lives have purpose to the extent that they contribute to the ongoing complexification and beautification and conscientization of nature. So that gives our own lives significance in that context. So your last question was...
Well, this idea that we're kind of waiting, I mean, it increasingly does seem clear that we have to move to a higher level of organization, first of all, in a concrete sense, more in the way, from my ideological standpoint, I would say more in the way of global governance, less raw nationalism, but it also seems that we need something in the non-political realm, in the spiritual realm, and I'm just wondering what form might that take? It would be great to know.
Well, this is where I would want to bring up one of his most fundamental and creative ideas, and it's contained in the axiom that true union differentiates. True union doesn't homogenize. He was interested in the neo-collectivist movements of the 20th century because they do manifest a kind of almost biological impulse or instinct to unify. But it's not a unity, it's really a uniformity that happens, and it's an enslaving uniformity. This is why he thought we need, in order to have true unity, you need to have the entities that are being unified to feel that they are actually finding their distinct identity by virtue of linking up with others. That applies at the psychological level of persons, and it's a very Jungian idea of individuation, but also at the level of nations, of languages and peoples. So he thought that we need to preserve diversity, which is an ecological principle too, at the level of people as well. But the only way that this can happen, and that's the only way it's happened in the past, is when the entities that are being brought together are brought together around a center which gives them back their identity rather than dissolving them into some homogeneity. And this is what we should be looking for at this point in human history. We should be looking for a center around which we can unify. And this is how he wanted to understand the notion of God interreligiously as the center that can unify but also differentiate. So he's not looking for a kind of conversion of the world to some monogenistic and homogeneous religious type, but he wants, at least in principle, he never spelled this out carefully enough, but he wants in principle a religious world in which there can be both differentiation and unity. But that requires a much more intense centration than we have now. Now we have...
And what does centration mean?
It's the tendency of matter from the beginning to organize itself around a center. This happened in the nucleus, when the nucleus of the atom organized the subatomic elements into something.
So all of humankind has to be focused on
this is the ideal. This is the ideal. And in fact, whether it can be achieved on this planet is another question. Occasionally he realized that maybe, for all we know, what's going on our planet is being duplicated on planets elsewhere. There's a tendency in the universe to bring about more complexity. And we know from astrophysics that this has happened at the level of atoms and that there are organic compounds out there and so forth. So he had this principle which he called the law of complexity consciousness, that consciousness increases in the universe in direct proportion to the increase of physiological complexity. So we would not have consciousness ourselves apart from the substructure of a very complex brain and central nervous system. And there's a centration involved in us. I mean, think of it. You have trillions of synaptic connections coming together, allowing us each to utter that first personal pronoun, I. So it's a kind of white-hot centration that was necessary to bring us about. Earlier, in a less intense form, it happened in the eukaryotic cell. It happened in the building of vertebrates in animals and so forth. So if we want to take any lessons from evolution, one of them should be that we need to look for a center, a new and higher center, a super center, as it were. Sounds like basketball. That can integrate the elements into some higher synthesis. And there are elements, I think, in his thought that point out how this has to happen at a cosmic level. And so he has hope for the universe. He's one of the few thinkers who thinks the cosmos is not just a place where absurd things are going on and life sort of squeaks out as a fluke and mind comes in as a kind of afterthought. No, he backs up and says, look, this whole cosmos has been pretty impressive so far. And why should we assume that now that it has produced us, that it has reached its climax, as it were? He's open to a very, I think, cosmic kind of destiny for the cosmos. And I sympathize with that. I think there are too few people in the intellectual community, including the theological community, who have cosmic hope. And yet I wonder if we can make sense of anything unless the whole universe makes sense somehow.
Yeah. So we've spent a lot of time on Teilhard de Chardin, but I think he illustrates a lot of issues that arise if you're going to do theology in a scientific age. And I guess one question he kind of frames is, so if you're going to put together a Christian theology that is scientifically respectable, obviously it's not going to be exactly like what you see in the Bible. You're probably going to have a less anthropomorphic God, a whole lot of other things, and a lot of things in the Bible you're going to either ignore or say are metaphors. But I assume that you would say, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, that anything that is going to qualify as a Christian theology would feature at least these two themes that we've covered. One is purpose and one is love.
Yes.
And that love is part of the purpose.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What other fundamental elements would you say have to survive if you're going to have a Christian theology in an age of science or in any other age? I mean, what is fundamental?
Well, truth. That's the integrating thing to which I refer to as the awakening of the universe. We feel, for example, in that question that you just asked me, I can look upon you as part of the universe. Through you, the universe has anticipated meaning, deeper understanding in your questions to me. And behind that, there's a deep trust that you have, and we all have it, that truth is worth seeking. And I think that if we're going to talk about science and faith, we have to find some common ground. That faith somehow is an awakening to truth, and so is science. But that science awakens to truth in a methodologically different sort of way, in a self-limiting way. Science says we're not going to talk, and since the beginning of the modern age, we're not going to talk about purpose, meaning, God, subjectivity. We're going to leave all these things out and talk about the series of physical causes that leads from state A to state B. To put it very simply. And that's perfectly okay. And I want to, as a theologian, I want to push that kind of search for truth as far as I possibly can. Because I see that way of looking for truth is in no way conflicts with my sense that faith is awakening to truth in a richer sense, a truth that is correlative to goodness and beauty. And meaning. And so that kind of awakening is completely compatible with a universe that's awakening through science to another way of looking at truth. And I want to emphasize, too, how much I love science, how much I respect science, how much I get from science in my own theology. It was science, after all, that discovered step by step that we live in a 13.8 billion year old universe. And it was science that discovered the evolutionary character of life and so many, many other things, which sometimes theology has ignored arrogantly, I think. I believe that pushing scientific method as far as it can possibly go is completely compatible with a correlative awakening to truth and goodness and beauty in other ways as well.
Okay, so I mean, As for the 13 billion years, as you know, Bertrand Russell said, if the purpose of the universe is to create intelligence, why did it take so long to produce so little?
Yes.
I was thinking about that today, though, and I was thinking, as for the first 10 billion years, when there probably wasn't anything alive anywhere in the universe, I think we can count that as basically zero time in a sense. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember the night before Christmas, I'd be so excited, I'd be having trouble getting to sleep, and I remember thinking, if I can just get to sleep, then Christmas will be here, because there will be no passage of time between my getting to sleep and Christmas showing up, because there will be no conscious awareness of the passage of time. And so I think we can dismiss the 10 billion years as being kind of like those, right? I mean, it's not like there was somebody there drumming their fingers.
Except
right?
That's what makes the universe dramatic.
Okay.
And that's what makes Christmas dramatic for you, but it makes the universe dramatic for me, that it goes through this temporal duration, goes down so many blind alleys, experiments with so many different things. So the metaphor that we have to have for the universe today is no longer design. And for theology, the question is no longer, I think anyway, perhaps I'm an exception, whether design points to deity. But the real question, and interesting question, is whether the drama, the cosmic drama, carries a meaning. That to me is where theology should focus its attention.
I think oddly I'm about to sound more old-fashionedly religious than you, which is odd because I'm not very religious. But but doesn't it imply? I mean, a great story implies an author, right? I mean, isn't part of the argument that Teilhard might make? Now, of course, I know Teilhard said God is less in the Alpha than in the Omega, and we can talk about that. But I know you've said that Richard Dawkins is confused in thinking that religion would require a God that designs individual organisms.
Yeah.
And so his pointing out that natural selection did the job doesn't really speak to the ultimate question. But is it not, I guess I would say, is God not in theological circles still thought of as, among other things, a kind of answer to the question of why there's this place and it behaves the way it does?
Yeah. Oh, yes, but there are different ways of understanding why. And one of them is in terms of drama. When you attend a drama or when you read a great novel, you, at the beginning, don't know what's going on. And I want to understand the cosmos as dramatic in that sense. And we're still very, very early in this drama. We don't walk out of the play after Act 1 or Act 2 and think that we have figured it all out. If we're reading the Brothers Karamazov, we don't stop reading after chapter 15 because we still don't know what's going on. We wait it out. We acknowledge that there's a different kinds of meaning. I call it narrative coherence that pertains to the cosmos. And it's analogous to the kind of coherence that occurs as you keep reading the novel. Oh, these things are starting to come together. But that requires a kind of discipline which most science, most philosophy does not have, but which the Abrahamic tradition offers, and that's that you have to wait for significant things to happen. And the authentic life in the Bible, in biblical religion, is the life of waiting attentively in anticipation of something that has not yet come. So meaning has a not yet quality to it in my understanding of faith. And God, as the theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg and others have pointed out, in some very real sense, right now, I think we can say that God, too, is not yet. And the reason we can put it that way is that after Einstein and after Darwin, we discovered that we live in time in a much more intricate and serious and intense way than we did before. So the universe is a temporal reality, and that correlates with the notion of its dramatic quality. And because it's temporal, when you talk about what transcends time, it's not something spatial. It's something that, in a sense, is not yet. And this helps us explain, in a way, or make sense of the absence of God in our lives, that the not yet has not arrived. So how do we connect with God? Not through logic, not through design arguments and so forth. We connect with God by opening ourselves, as St. Paul says, in hope. And hope that is seen is not hope, but that's the condition of the believer from the beginning, at least in the biblical understanding of things. It goes way back in stories of Abraham, how Abraham did not know what was going on, but he followed the call into the future. What I like to do now is to link up the cosmos much more intricately with the Abrahamic hope for a fulfillment which is not yet, but which we hope for. Now, people might say that's not being very realistic, is it? And that's because we've defined realism in terms of a pessimistic understanding of the universe. The realist, for most intellectuals in the world today, for the academic world in general, the true realist is someone who faces up to the absurdity of the universe and who tries to make some kind of life out of this very dismal situation. And you need courage to do that, and courage is appealing. And so you can have tragic heroes, figures like Sisyphus, Prometheus, and Atlas, and so forth, who are idealized by Russell and Camus and others as a way of dealing with that. But to me, the cosmic pessimist is someone who suffers from impatience. How do we know that this is all there is to it? And this is why the discovery of time by Einstein and Darwin and this new sense of the universe still coming into being is so important. If the universe is still coming into being, how can it be expected to be fully intelligible? It's not even yet fully actual. So actuality and intelligibility are correlative terms. But the universe, if it's still not finished, if it's still not completed, is still not a universe. It's still we don't know exactly what's going on, but we can hope. And there's nothing unrealistic about that, because if you go back, take yourself back to the very first phase of this 13.8 billion years ago, a billion-year-old universe, and imagine that you're there at the beginning and you look out and all you see is this massive, monotonous sea of radiation. Who of us, if we were there, would have thought and expected that out of this very inauspicious beginning would eventually come even atoms, let alone cells, animals, humans, beings who have a capacity for love, who have this passion for truth and so forth. This is all part of the universe. If the universe has done this so far, why should we assume right here and now that this is the end of it all? Why can't we take it as more realistic, actually, to open ourselves to what is yet to come? That's the only way we could have been realistic in the past. I think this new... If we think about the fact that this universe is still coming into being, it makes a lot of difference in terms of what we call real. It makes the difference in terms of what we call faith, hope, and love. So there's nothing in the cosmos that contradicts the Abrahamic sense of the authentic life as one of patient waiting for something big to happen up ahead.
Okay, so for a while you're getting close to this what is God question. I said I'd save that to the end, and I do want to get to it shortly and then open it up for questions. I want to just take a one question kind of detour because it gets at this question of the domain within which science has authority, and also ways that that fact can be compatible with notions of purpose. It's a metaphor that I've heard you use repeatedly. It comes from John Polkinghorne. It's about a boiling pot of water, right?
Yes. When I taught science and religion to my students at Georgetown, one of the things I wanted to get them to realize, they're not going to get anywhere with this problem of science and religion unless they first allow for the possibility of what I call layered explanation. And by layered explanation, I mean to point to the fact that almost everything admits of a plurality of levels of understanding. If you can't allow for a plurality of levels of understanding, then everything is going to be collapsed into one way of looking at things. And then there's going to be a competition between different ways, including science and faith. So the whole science and religion conversation requires, if it's going to get anywhere at all, an acknowledgement that there can be many different levels of understanding. And the example that I used with them, and it's one that I picked up from John Polkinghorne, and I developed it. It's the suppose the pot of water is boiling on your stove in your kitchen, and somebody walks into the kitchen and asks, "Why is that water boiling? Explain it to me." And you say, "Well, it's boiling because the molecules of H2O are moving around excitedly, and they're making a transition from the liquid state to the gaseous state." And that's a very good explanation. In fact, you could spend a whole career as a scientist studying phase transitions. They're very interesting sorts of things. But you could also answer the question, why is the water boiling, by saying, because my wife turned the gas on. And it's a completely different way of looking at it. Or you could have answered by saying, it's boiling because I want tea. Now, the point of that example is to indicate that there's no conflict or competition between and among those levels of explanation. In other words, you don't say it's boiling because of molecular motion rather than because I want tea. And you don't say it's boiling because I want tea rather than because it's boiling. But so many, theology is kind of like an I want tea type of explanation. When I was attending this trial on intelligent design in Pennsylvania back in the 2004, 2005, the way the press formulated what was at issue in the trial was to say, what's at issue here is whether biodiversity came about by natural selection or instead by divine creativity. It's that introduction of a kind of rather than into the discussion that confused the whole issue. But there are certain kinds of explanations which are not conflicted, which are not rather than, but which are complementary and which can coexist easily with one another. Now, Richard Dawkins is someone who would say, no, there can't be a plurality of levels of explanation because that's a violation of what used to be called Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor was a maxim that was devised by medieval philosopher William of Ockham, who said that if you have a multiplicity of conflicting explanations, then a good rule of thumb is to take the one that makes the fewest assumptions. So Richard Dawkins and other evolutionists would say, well, now that we have Darwinian explanations of biodiversity, why do we need theological explanations? Well, William of Ockham would have dismissed Dawkins abruptly because he says, his maxim says, when there are conflicting explanations, then you can pick if there are conflicting explanations, pick the simple one. But my point with the layered explanation example is that these are not conflicting explanations. They can coexist very much alongside of each other. So just a simple logical move like that can, I think, go a long way toward making the whole conversation in science and religion much smoother. But in our culture, people are inclined academically and intellectually toward what I call explanatory monism. That is, there's only one level of explanation. Science has now given it to us, and that rules out any other kinds that were developed in the past. And as a Roman Catholic, one of the things that made it easy for me to get into science and religion was that a very conservative pope, Pope Leo XIII in 1893, which wasn't too long after Darwin, wrote in an encyclical, Providentissimus Deus, instructed Catholics, do not look for scientific information in the scriptures. And that simple instruction, don't look for science in Scripture, don't look for anything in science, prevented Catholics for several generations from thinking that there's a conflict between science and religion. So there's an explanatory monism intellectually, and the parallel to that in the religious world is literalism. Biblical literalism in a scientific age assumes that somehow the Bible should be teaching the right science, and the right science conflicts with the wrong science of Darwin and Newton, Copernicus, and the rest. If you want a good example of this, go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, and you'll see in each display they show what biblical science tells us in one part of the display and what non-biblical or secular science says in the other. They place them in direct conflict with one another. And the assumption underlying that is somehow the Bible is in the business of giving us the purest sort of scientific information. But that's the kind of literalist monism that goes hand in hand with explanatory monism of the intellectual community, and that's a toxic sort of mixture. It's a combination of poor religious education, poor science education, and that, I think, is partly responsible for the problems we have, or the pseudo-problems that we have in science and religion.
Yeah, and I have to say the takeaway from that boiling pot metaphor is really something that a lot of scientists have trouble grasping. I mean, if you say, is it possible that there is some purpose unfolding through evolution, the tendency is to immediately jump to the conclusion that you're talking intelligent design or some spooky force assisting natural selection, as opposed to just suggesting that, well, no, it's just natural selection. It's just this material process driving it. But maybe it was, in some sense or another, set in motion for a purpose. It could have been set in motion by aliens who planted the seed of life. It could have been set in motion in a kind of non-anthropomorphic way by some kind of meta-natural selection among universes. There have been scenarios like this. But my point is that scientists, you really have to stop and drive the point home. Now, Darwin got the picture immediately. I mean, I think there was a theologian named Charles Kingsley.
Charles Kingsley.
Yeah, and he wrote Darwin about the possibility that natural selection was an instrument of divine creation, and Darwin's like, yeah, it could be. I don't think Darwin ultimately believed, at least certainly not firmly, that it was. Darwin had trouble with the theodicy, the problem of evil, as manifest in natural selection. He looked at all the cruelty of nature, and he's like, why would a good and omnipotent God create this, which of course is ultimately the same theodicy problem you face without thinking about natural selection. But in any event, Darwin saw that at least there was in principle a possible logical compatibility between a purposive nature and his scientific explanation of how evolution had happened.
Well, he didn't object to Kingsley when Kingsley wrote to him.
Right.
He said, "Thank you for giving us this picture, because this universe that you've given us is much more interesting than the one in which God pulls all the strings, as it were." And Kingsley was one of those who said, as Teilhard de Chardin did later on, that what's really going on here is not whether God makes things, but whether God makes things that can make themselves. And that's the kind of universe we have. And natural selection, let me just say a final word about natural selection. Natural selection is only one ingredient of the evolutionary way of accounting for life. There's also a lot of contingency, a lot of randomness, and so forth. So you have a combination of accidents, if you will, or contingency is the technical term, plus the necessity, the remorseless regularity of natural selection, plus lots and lots of time. Now, if you look at those three ingredients, contingency, invariance, and time, you have the ingredients of story or drama. So that's why I feel scientifically justified in referring to the universe as dramatic, because it has been from the beginning a mixture of these elements. If it were purely a matter of necessity, then you would not have a story. You would know the end. The end is already tied up in the beginning. If it were purely a matter of chance, without some principle of invariance and consistency, it would all be chaos, just droplets of experience. And of course, you need time. And now we have lots and lots of time. Somebody once asked a rabbi, "Rabbi, why did God create humans?" And the rabbi replied, "Because God loves stories." And I like to apply that to the cosmos that we have. Maybe God loves really, really big stories. So we have the ingredients of drama, but a drama is something that's still working itself out, And the only way we can be realistic and take into consideration what's going on now is to learn the disposition, the posture of bridled expectation or attentive waiting. And I think that brings that understanding of realism into tune with the Abrahamic theme of hope.
Okay, so we are getting back to the question of what is God. Now, in that pot boiling metaphor, it's a pretty straightforward conception of where the purpose comes from. Somebody sets the process in motion with a purpose in mind. And I thought I heard you kind of resisting the divine analog of that. In other words, thinking of God that way. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. I mean, I guess I would ask, I'm sure that when your undergraduates at Georgetown have come up to you kind of confused. Maybe they grew up with a very traditional kind of anthropomorphic conception of God, and said, well, how should I think of God? And they want to be in relation to God. And you just said maybe God wants something in the present tense, as if God is kind of out there. So I'm not sure where you are on this issue. I'm honestly not sure what Teilhard meant by God is more in the omega than in the alpha. If you're saying God is just becoming and just starting to take shape, and then what is it that a religious person is in relationship to now? How should a religious person in a scientifically respectable way conceive of the divine?
Yeah. Well, my students also used to ask me, what is a theologian? And I would say a theologian is somebody who doesn't make much money, but at least knows why. And so I get the question of teleology there. But yeah, I have to be careful here. And in this brief conversation, I can't really spell out all the nuances that would have to be articulated to respond to your question. But I think let's come back to something that you experience within yourself, Bob Wright, and I've experienced it in the way you've probed me and asked questions of me, and I think there's a deep longing in you and people here tonight, myself, for truth, for right understanding. I spell it R-I-G-H-T.
Well, I can't have everything, I guess. But.
Right understanding. That's what you're looking for. You've probed what I've said here, and you see a lot of things that don't quite fit together, and you want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying correctly. But after you've done that, there's even something more that you'll have to ask, and that's whether my understanding or your understanding of what I'm saying is correct understanding. So there are two kinds of longing. And here I'm falling back on one of my favorite philosophers, the Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan. There's a longing for understanding, for bright ideas, let's say. But beneath that, once you have your bright ideas, a stirring within us, sometimes unsettling, begins to occur, and is my bright idea a true idea? And that takes a certain amount of courage, maturity, and virtue. Some people, as you know, even in the scientific community, can get so entranced by their bright ideas that they must assume they're right ideas. But there's something about good science, and this has sustained the scientific revolution throughout its career at its best, and that's the willingness to give up, to sacrifice our bright ideas on the altar of right ideas. And that takes a certain fiduciary element, as Michael Polanyi calls it, a certain faith element. There's the faith that truth is worth seeking. And I think that to respond to your question, what is God? One way of thinking what God is the depth of truth. that has already silently grasped hold of us, surrounded us in a tacit and ungraspable, mysterious way that pulls out of us this longing, this deeper longing that makes us willing to even sacrifice our superficial, though I've gotten rich on these ideas, I have to give them up now. That sacrificial dimension can be possible only if one is, here's where Paul Tillich comes in. Paul Tillich defined faith as a state of being grasped by something of ultimate concern. And I know a lot of scientists who are not believing Christians or in any other faith tradition. I think of Einstein like this, and whom I admire because they illustrate this Tillichian, Paul Tillich, who taught here, by the way, many years ago, understanding of faith as allowing oneself to be taken hold of, to be carried away by something so much larger than yourself. So much more worthwhile than yourself, that you're willing to sacrifice shallow understanding for the sake of the pursuit of that. And sometimes he says, in a wonderful meditation of his called The Depth of Existence, it's in a book called The Shaking of the Foundations. He used to give sermons here. I don't know whether it was in this chapel or not. Some people said the only time Tillich would come to chapel was when he gave a sermon. But anyway, he would give sermons or meditations, and one of them was on the depth of existence. And he says, I know a lot of you out there don't believe in God or don't think you believe in God. So let's see if we can find something in your experience that you can bounce this word God off of so that it makes some sort of sense to you. And he asked them, as they were sitting there, to reflect on their relationships with others. He said, you form a relationship with another, and you think you know that person, but sooner or later that person will disappoint you or surprise you, so that if you're going to continue the relationship, you have to dig a deeper level. And so you relate to the person on that level for a while. But then the same thing happens over and over again. And sooner or later you come to the realization that you'll never reach rock bottom in probing the depth of that other person. So there's a depth dimension, an inexhaustible depth dimension that you'll eventually come to. And you'll shrink back from it at first because it seems to be an abyss. But if you allow yourself to be carried into it, you find yourself on solid ground. He used very earthly metaphors. So when he talks about the ground of existence, or the ground of being, he's talking about that experience you have of the dimension of depth, where you feel more grounded than you did before. And this experience of depth you can find not only in your relationship with others, but also in your relationship to yourself. When we're young, we form a self-image, mirroring back to us of what parents and siblings and others have thought of us. But as we develop, we have new experiences and so forth. Eventually, we realize that we ourselves are not what we thought we were. He was influenced by depth psychology in this respect, too. But he wants to go even deeper than the depth psychologist. There's an infinite and inexhaustible depth dimension in each one of us that is there, but which we avoid. We shrink back from it. It's an abyss, but if we allow ourselves to be shaken into it, this is the shaking of the foundations, we find ourselves on more solid ground than before. And just one final example, in the natural world there's something similar. The way in which humans relate to nature also shows that there is a depth dimension to nature. And science itself, the history of science, is a good example of that. We thought 1,000 years ago that Ptolemy had pretty much wrapped it up. But then Copernicus came along. An earthquake occurred in science, and so we had to go to a deeper level. We thought that Newton, Alexander Pope said, nature and nature's laws said, lay hid in night, but God said, let Newton be, and all was light. So for several centuries, we thought that Newton had it all wrapped up. But then Einstein comes along, just to use one example, or Darwin, and the surface of nature begins to crack, and then an earthquake occurs, and we're rocked into the depth. So it's actually the fact that nature, too, has an inexhaustible dimension of depth that makes science possible, that makes scientific progress possible, as it were. Now, what's he leading to? He's leading to this. He says in this meditation, the name of this inexhaustible depth is God. That depth is what the word God means. And if that word God has no meaning to you, don't use it. But think of the depth of your existence, of the depth of your experience of other persons, of nature, and also society and its history. Nowhere do we remain on the surface more than in our social and economic and political lives. And it usually takes an earthquake to crack open our social understanding of things to get to the depth. But the name of this depth is God. And so the person who knows about depth knows about God. So he says, you cannot then, if you've experienced this depth, and many people who would call themselves non-religious have experienced it more deeply than religious people. And this is why Tillich is very appreciative of modern atheism. He thought Nietzsche, for example, was somebody who is rocking us into the depth. But unlike Nietzsche, Tillich says that what God means is that inexhaustible depth out of which voices from poetry and religion and philosophy and science too tell us to go deeper. So faith means allowing yourself to be grasped by this inexhaustible dimension of depth. And if that depth is what the word God means, then that is his answer to what is God.
So we've gotten around to the answer now. So we're about ready to take questions from the audience. I want to ask one more question, and I think maybe I'll ask for a one-sentence answer because I'm sure they're eager to ask questions. And we've gone on longer than I thought we would, but it's because what you've said has been so rich. I want to just first of all say I think one thing I like about your worldview is, as I understand it, you see religion itself as evolving.
Yes.
And I know you have skepticism about so-called perennialism and any view which holds that, back in ancient times there was some pristine revelation, and they had it right, but we've fallen away from that. It's been corrupted by politics or something, and now we're confused. I think your view is we still don't get the picture totally, and so religion is an evolution. And so human history is a process of enlightenment in two domains, in science and in spirituality, and the two are in conversation, and spirituality has a lot to learn from science and gets refined in light of science. Yeah. It's a process of enlightenment. I guess maybe it's actually two questions, and so you get two sentences, maybe even more if you want. One is, I assume you're still open to so you reject the idea of perennialism, that there's this source at the top of the mountain, this enlightenment, and it flowed down along these different streams, these different traditions, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and you reject that. Yeah. But then there's the reverse. There's the climbing the mountain metaphor, where we're approaching the truth from one angle, so maybe Christians from one angle, Hindus from, and so on, but there is a truth, and we may well converge on the same fundamental conception of things. So I want to just
you said that was the perennialist view, and that was all formulated in a pre-scientific era. And the assumption of the perennialist is that there was this primordial, pure, pristine revelation, but that when time, it's a very Platonic idea, for Plato, time is where things get messed up and confused, and we have to get back to eternity. So perennialism is deeply influenced by Plato. And the idea of the perennialist approach to religion is that you don't have to move from one religion to the other. Just follow your own river back upstream, and you get to the top of the mountain where the primordial revelation took place, and there you will converge with others. But this whole way of thinking implies a pre-evolutionary understanding of humanity and of history. I believe that we live, I know we live in an unfinished universe. And if that's true, then everything in this unfinished universe is still unfinished. And that includes our religious traditions. Mm-hmm. So instead of thinking of religion as a return to the purity of origins, think of all of our religions as different ways of awakening to what is not yet. And in some sense, that not yet can be attributed to God. I don't mean that in a way that in any way diminishes divine transcendence and divine love. I think it's out of divine love, self-emptying love, that God retreats, you might say, into the future so that something other than God can come into existence. That is one way of understanding the doctrine of creation. Creation is not divine pyrotechnics. Creation is what happens when the infinite, in a sense, retracts itself. This is the Tzimtzum notion in Judaism. It's the notion of kenosis in Christianity. It's the Tao-like humility in Taoism. We think of ultimate reality as humble, as letting itself out of the picture, in a sense, which is in no way a deistic departure, but it's the deepest form of involvement, that God would allow something other than God to come into existence. And when I talk about the future, the not yet, I don't mean it in an empty sense. I mean it as the result of the divine self-emptying, which allows for a universe to come into existence and be attracted. And it's also the ground of our freedom. One of the biggest questions in theology has always been, how can you reconcile human freedom with the existence of an all-powerful, almighty deity who seems to be governing everything? And this is why I want to switch the metaphor of the universe from design to drama, and the metaphor for divine action from governance to attraction, to lure, to love, in other words. Love lets the other be. So it's out of love that I want to think of God as in some sense not yet. It gives us a space for our own existence and for the universe's existence, but is in no way uninvolved, but is so involved that God wants the independence of the creature. God wills, as Wolfhart Pannenberg says, God wills the independence of the world. But in order to do that, God allows the divine self to be humbled, to be, you can use the word in a sense, Jürgen Moltmann says, this God withdraws in order to allow for something other than God to come into existence. That's not deism, that's the deepest form of involvement. And this God is willing to wait. So the waiting is not just on the part of the world waiting for the divine, but it's also on the part of the divine. Divine providence, Moltmann says, divine care is manifested most especially when God allows space and time for the other to be. And that's how I want to understand the being of the world in relation to the divine.
Okay. Well, I am going to finally deliver on my long-standing promise to open this up to questions from the audience. We have a microphone back there, and in fact, Ben, if you want to be the one who chooses people who have questions, if anyone has a question. There's a question.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on the
A little bit louder.
discussion of Tillich and the ground of being. So I think what Tillich meant by the ground of being was not that what God is the ground of being, but the concept of God, the idea that people are looking for when they try to talk about God is the ground of being. And this is also where religion and science come together, because science is seeking the ground of being. Christianity is every religion, whether it's Brahma, whether it's, Shiva, whether it's the Christian God or Allah or anyone else, but they're all seeking the ground of being. And what Tillich is saying is that you cannot speak about what God is, you can only speak symbolically about God. So there's, the cross, there's this, there's that. Every religion has different symbols and ways of approaching God, just as science does. So you could say the Big Bang is the ground of being for science. And all of these different ways of looking at things have incredibly fantastic explanations. So you have the Christian explanation of a being running around and saying, let there be light, and then later creating the sun, the moon, and the stars. You have the Big Bang, you have string theory vibrating in 11 dimensions, you have quantum, the insanity of quantum physics. So that was really what Tillich was doing. And he was trying to unite scientific and religious views with that concept. And that's why he would never say what God is. And in fact, he was very clear that God did not exist, does not exist, in the Courage to Be, in other words. So if you have
that has to be carefully understood. Thank you. He used the term ground of being because he noticed that most religious people, including most Christians, tend to identify God not with being itself or the power of being, but with a being, as it were. And he thought it diminishes deity to identify God with a particular being. So this is why he emphasized that God is the ground of being in that sense. But he also, in terms of the sermon that I was speaking from, used the term ground in his understanding, his phenomenology of religion. And here he was following his friend and theologian he deeply respected, Rudolf Otto, who when Otto talked about the experience of God, or the experience of the sacred, found in his study of religions that people in general think of the sacred as a mysterium, a mystery, that's tremendum, that is, it causes a kind of sense of anxiety and trembling in the religious participant, but it's also fascinans, that is also seductive and satisfying as well. So there's two sides to the experience of the sacred. Mysterium is one is the what has been experienced, but it's also tremendum and fascinans. Tillich correlated that with his notion that God is depth, but depth has two sides to it too. It's abyss, he said, but it's also ground. So he's using ground in that metaphorical sense to correlate with the notion of fascinans in Rudolf Otto's phenomenology of religion. But above all, he was trying to emphasize that we tend to become, religion tends to become idolatry. This is the great insight of almost all the religions. We tend to condense the divine into something that we can manipulate and control. And that's the reason why we tend to identify God with a being. But God is not a being. God is the ground of being. So when he says God does not exist, it's not in the atheistic sense of the term. It's the sense that God is not one being among others. And that's why he wanted to prevent God from being naturalized. And in his conversation with science, he insisted that the real problem is not science, but naturalism. That's the view that nature is really all there is. So.
Any other questions? There's one up here.
Consider me passé, but where do you put Christ in this? Because Christ is still
Very good.
abroad.
Yeah.
He's still...
I didn't talk about that tonight. I usually, most of the time when I talk about religion and science, I do it in an interreligious context. But I am deeply Christian myself, and I have no trouble with the Teilhardian view of Christ as the Christian name for that ultimate meaning or destiny that sums up the whole of cosmic process. Teilhard noticed in his science that the universe seems to be moving from multiplicity toward unity. It started out with just subatomic plasma, but over the course of time, something very interesting has happened. It has increasingly been brought around centers that integrated into more complex forms of being. Ultimately, Christ fits in as the center in this whole cosmic centration. In order for Christ to be a center, in order for there to be a center that unifies the mass of humanity, the center has to be something concrete. It can't be just an idea. It has to be something real. Secondly, if it's going to appeal to persons, it has to be at least personal itself. Thirdly, if it's to be something that we are in contact with and that can summon forth our fidelity and our devotion, it has to be part of our history. It has to be something available within the context of our human existence. And fourthly, if it's to be a new center that raises the mass up to a new level, intensity of being, it has to be transcendent. And he finds in the doctrines and Christology of the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed the fulfillment of those four elements. And I myself, I'm a Catholic. I go to Mass every Sunday. I have no trouble at all reconciling the Nicene Creed with that cosmic vision. And I learned that especially from Teilhard.
Okay, we have time for one more, or maybe we've got two. Maybe why don't you go ahead and both ask your questions consecutively before he answers, and then he'll address them, and then we'll probably have to adjourn.
As I listened to you, I was thinking of you and your role as a teacher and wondering what you might say to a student who burst into your office one day reporting that he or she had just read Bertrand Russell's anthology, Why I'm Not a Christian, and how you might address that.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the books that I don't know whether I ever used that in class, but I often referred to it. And to make a long story short, what I try to do throughout my course is try to get students to be able to distinguish between science and scientism. And Bertrand Russell is the paradigmatic example of somebody who was devoted to the ideology, I call it, or the faith system, that science is the only reliable road to truth. He was so saturated by this, I call it, belief system, that it affected everything he did and everything he writes and Why I'm Not a Christian and in his philosophy in general, has a tacit belief system which even he is perhaps not always aware of, that maintains that only those things which can be identified by either logical analysis or empirical discovery should be taken as true. But what I would say briefly is that scientism is a self-subverting, a self-sabotaging belief system. Scientism says take nothing on faith, but yet it takes faith to embrace scientism. There are no set of scientific experiments that you would set up to demonstrate that science is the only road to truth. Because even in setting up those experiments, you're already believing that science is the only road to truth. So scientism is a faith system. And if scientism says take nothing on faith, which is what Richard Dawkins has built his career saying, not just Bertrand Russell, but many others, Daniel Dennett, if scientism is a faith system which says take nothing on faith, then you need not take scientism seriously either. In a nutshell. It's more involved than that, but that's brief.
Final question there?
I wanted to ask you about Bertrand Russell's mathematics partner, Alfred North Whitehead, and you alluded to him a couple of times, and I wonder if how much he's influencing your views of the evolving cosmos, and particularly the consequent nature of God, for example, since you look toward the future in your...
Yes, when I first started teaching my science and religion course at Georgetown, I saw that I needed a philosophical framework which was more rigorous than Teilhard's. And I had been trained as a Thomist, and that's a rigorous system, but unfortunately Thomism, and I still believe this, was ingenious in his own century. If Thomas were here today, and as venturous as he was, after all, he went to a pagan philosopher, Aristotle, to get concepts to understand his own faith system. If he were here today, he would not be a Thomist. He would be looking for other ways of articulating what we understand about the world. And I found in Alfred North Whitehead, a philosopher who had based his philosophy on experience of so many different areas of life, including the aesthetic, including mathematical, including the philosophical tradition, part of which he was familiar with, but including also religious experience and he wanted his worldview to be based on a wide range of experiences. So I found in Whitehead somebody that I still love dearly. I don't agree with everything he says by any means. His understanding of God is not quite identifiable with the one that I've been talking about tonight. But what I learned from Whitehead more than from anyone else is how science, which he loved himself, is a very abstract way of looking at the world. It leaves out most of what's going on. And you need another kind of discourse to retrieve the richer dimensions of reality. And this is where he makes a place for symbolism and religion and art and others as bringing in front of us so much that science leaves out. Science, he says, is guilty, as you know, of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It takes things which are mathematical abstractions, and has made believe for 3 or 4 centuries that these abstractions are the real world. But that real world is not real at all. It's an abstraction which leaves out most of what's going on. So I loved Whitehead because he helped me realize how much we can learn, not just from science, which we can learn a lot from, but also from other things like poetry. He was a big fan of Wordsworth, as I am myself. So I really appreciate Whitehead's thought. That's just part of an answer.
Okay, so again, thank you all for coming. And John, I just really have to thank you. We've gone on a little longer than I expected, and that's because I was so interested, and I could have gone on
Time is infinite.
A lot longer. Yeah, I think we saw tonight the fruits of a long body of work, and I'm not the only one to have noticed that, because I know a publisher approached you recently about putting together a volume called A John Haught Reader, which will come out in a month, the kind of greatest hits. So you could, his most recent book is called The New Cosmic Story Inside Our Awakening Universe. You can get that and also get the next book in a month or two, a John Haught Reader. So I really want to thank you for coming to talk to us tonight, and especially to thank you for the decades of really earnest grappling with deep questions that set the stage for tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.